Good morning or afternoon. I have not started looking to see if you've turned in your test yet, but it's still uh, fairly early in the morning, and hopefully you'll get those in. Well, you got them in yesterday, and hopefully you did well. I'm sure you did. What I want to do, we're going to jump into the next chapter. I know y'all are excited. This is chapter 16. Now, I will say we are going to skip over pages 347, 348, 349, 350, 351, and 352. The reason for that, you learned all of that in American history, U.S. history, American Republic, all of those classes. You're very familiar with the story of America's independence. And so what I want to do is move into others' quest for freedom and attempts at liberty. So we're going to start with France, or France, and that's where I want to begin. Page 353, actually. It starts on 352 at the very bottom. But one thing that your book mentions, French philosophies, or philosophes, had espoused the idea of personal rights and liberties. I want you to listen to this Proverbs. It's in your book, top of 353. It's Proverbs 29:2. It says, "When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn." If you've got a good leader, we've talked about this a bunch. If you've got a good leader, things are good for the people. But if you've got a wicked leader, then things are bad. And that is where the French people found themselves. The French saw the United States and what they went through. And now the French see the United States as free. And they have all of these freedoms, and it's a wonderful thing. And France craves this. Now, one thing that your book uses the term old regime, basically the people that have been in power forever. Trump would call it the swamp, so to speak. But it's people that had been in charge for years and years, the old regime. But one thing you've got to understand about France and the way they were set up, they had different estates, where some countries have upper class, middle class, and lower class. France had estates. It's easy to remember they had first estate, second estate, and third estate. Can you name them with me? First estate, second estate, third estate. Now, the first estate was clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, your book has this handy-dandy chart on 353. The print is so small I can barely see it. The first estate was made up of about 120,000 people. This was a little less than half of 1%. So 0.5% of the population was the first estate. That is the top of the top. And if you'll recall, clergy do not pay taxes. That was part of the way they did things. So they got to enjoy all the fruits of the nation, but did not pay taxes. The second estate was made up of nobles. Now, one thing I want you to understand, your book doesn't talk about this, but in England, to inherit nobility, per se, official nobility, you had to be the son or daughter of a king. So if I'm King Daniel the First, and I have a son, King Hunter Daniel, since he is my son, he would be the heir to the throne. And it says low battery, so I'm not touching my face, I'm touching the screen. He would be nobility, considered nobility. In France, all of the children of nobles would be nobility. There we go. This is a fun video. It's like a roller coaster ride. There were about 50,000 noble families in France, about 250 nobles per se. And you'll see in your book total, throughout the country, there were about 350,000 that belonged to the second estate. Now, the thing about the second estate, they had ways around paying taxes. They got to enjoy the fruits of the nation and didn't have to pay in. And then you see this big purple swatch. It's the third estate. and it is about 98% of the population. I believe that says 24 million people were part of the Third Estate. Most of those were peasants. Peasants. They were peasant farmers. France had this feudal system. They had had it for years. And so this feudal system basically meant that they were tied to nobles. They had to do the work. And the thing about the peasants, and I want you to remember this, and we're on page 354 now. Peasants, first of all, made very little money. They had to work an awful lot. They had very few rights, if any. And here's what it says they had to pay, and your book lists them nicely. They had to pay an annual fee to the noble who owned the land on which they lived or worked. They also had to pay a fee to the former owner when land changed hands. So not only would you have to pay for who owns it now, but who owned it before. Had to pay an annual fee for the use of mills, ovens, and wine presses. Even if you did not use them, you had to pay for them. You had to perform a corvée, which was a system of forced labor. And your book mentions that most peasants during the 18th century worked for the government. They built and maintained roads and canals. But they had to perform those duties, those labors. And last of all, they had to respect nobles' hunting rights. Nobles were allowed, it was a long-standing tradition in France. It didn't matter whether you owned the property or not. If I knew you had some great property with some deer on it, I don't own it, but if I were a noble, I get to hunt it anyway. And you've got to respect that and allow me to do it. Plus, you were forbidden to kill rabbits, crows, or foxes, even if the animals got in and ruined your crop. So you see, the peasants had it bad. Now, we talked about the absolute fashion of King Louis XV or 14th. King Louis XV and Louis XVI, they weren't all into that. They didn't care about government that much, and that's one thing you need to understand. What they did, they were about living it up. They were about having a good time. They were about drinking and partying and just carrying on. You'll see that Versailles, if you read about a lot of history and you study it a whole bunch, Versailles was a party palace. And that's what they cared about. They had the balls, and they had the dances, and they had the games, and they had all of these things. And it was just the French noble life, and the kings were living it. Louis XV and Louis XVI. They had very little to do with government. So what happened is the local rulers started taking over, the local rulers. And we talked about the unbalanced tax system, and it was very unfair. But the problem was France was bankrupt. They got so bankrupt to the point that creditors would no longer loan them money. And the government levied more taxes, and they didn't know how much they owed because France didn't have a budget. I mean, that shows how little that the kings had to do with. They didn't even have a budget. I mean, they just spent, did whatever. So private banks refused to extend any more credit to the French government. And so Louis tried to solve, Louis XVI tried to solve the economic problems through his financial ministers. And they said that there was no more money. So they said, hey, you need to charge those who aren't paying taxes, the nobles, the clergy. Well, he didn't like that. He refused, and he said, hey, it's the Estates General that is responsible for taxes. I don't want anything to do with this. Now, hopefully you'll recall several chapters ago we talked about when kings would try to levy taxes, and in Britain, a branch of government formed out of the tax levying system called Parliament. And in France, we talked about in France, there was a group of folks that were formed to levy taxes. They were called the Estates General. Now, Parliament picked up more power in British government, but in France, the Estates General, they stuck to taxes. And the problem was they hadn't met since 1614. And we're talking many, many years later. In 1789, so 185 years, is that right? After they had met before, they got together, and Louis called for them to meet, and he said, hey, everybody write down your grievances. And the first estate, the second estate, the third estate, y'all all get together, send your representatives to the Estates General, bring some grievances. The official word is cahiers, but bring those, and y'all discuss those? Well, they did. And the problem was they did not call for a constitution. Now, this is what's going to lead to the revolution, because they came back to Louis, and Louis really didn't care. And he said, here's what I want you to do. Let's take some votes, but I want every estate represented to have one vote. And we've already talked, that's why that chart is so important. 98% of the population is third estate, but they're representing a certain number of estates. If all of them voted in block, 98% of the country, who is in the majority? It's the third estate. But if they're voting representing nobles, their votes are cut drastically. And so anyway, they balked, and long story short, the third estate gets together. They were going to meet in a building. It was locked to them. They couldn't get in. So they meet inside at a royal tennis court or noble tennis court. And they come up with the tennis court oath. The tennis court oath is basically where they say, we're not disbanding. We're going to stick together until we form a constitution. Well, the king didn't like this. And so he sends some soldiers to, he says he's going to protect them. But he was basically going to break up the little shindig they had going on. Well, July the 12th, angry mobs meet in Paris. They're rioting and looting. And the forces come in. They had been angered by the high prices of bread, and that they had heard that Louis's troops were going to kill them. So they started looking for weapons because they didn't have any weapons. And they knew there were some in the hospital, and they knew there were some in the prison. The hospital was called the Hôtel des Invalides. And yeah, that was terrible French, but anyway, I took French for 2 years and still can't speak it. The other one was the Bastille. Now, the Bastille is the more famous of the two. But basically what happened is they grabbed weapons. The gates of the Bastille opened up, and the mob poured in. And they actually killed the governor of the prison there at the Bastille. And that was the beginning of the revolution. And we're going to go into more of the phases later on. The sad thing that you'll see in the end, the French Revolution did not solve a lot of problems for France. It was unlike America. And I guess if we went back over the first part of this chapter, we know that in America, we were longing for rights, and we tried to set up a government that maintained those rights. In France, they end up with rulers like Napoleon. We're going to see that through this revolution. So it's kind of a sad thing. But here's what I want you to do. In the remaining time that we have allotted for this class, I want you to read over the material, page 352 to 357. Stop at the phases of the revolution on page 357. So don't read past that. We'll cover that tomorrow. But what I also want you to do, I want you to submit a little something for me. I want you to write a paragraph or two. And I want you to think. Don't just write something to respond. Y'all are very smart students, and I know you can do this well. Here's a question I have for you. What would you try to do? What extent would you go to? What efforts would you put forth if you lived in a country where your voice didn't matter, you had no rights, you had no constitutional protections? In other words, I live in a land that I could cry out, hey, this is unfair, I have no rights, and nobody listens, nobody cares. What would you do? Would you revolt? Would you go out and protest? What would you do personally? And there's no right or wrong answer. This is just your perception. I want you to think, and I want you to really, first of all, take into account the blessings we have in this country. We don't have to worry about that. We may call up our representative and they not seem to care, but we get to vote at the voting booth and vote them out of office. We have a voice. But what if you had no voice? To what extent would you go to change your situation? Put that in the submit over on the right-hand side. You can do it with a PDF. You can send me a picture. You can type it in a Google Docs. matters not. Again, miss y'all. I hate to keep saying that, but I had a student. In fact, it was one of y'all had put something, and I made the comment, miss y'all, and they said, miss you too. And when I read that, I nearly started tearing up. I mean, really did. I miss y'all, and hopefully this will be over soon. Read that, get that done, and we'll meet again tomorrow.